Ted Bundy, inside the mind of a serial killer. Introduction. Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we're going to explore one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. The story we're about to examine goes far beyond the typical narrative of a serial killer. We'll be looking deep into the life, crimes, and psychology of Theodore Robert Bundy, a man whose name has become synonymous with evil itself, yet whose charming exterior fooled countless people for years. Ted Bundy killed at least 30 women that we know of, though experts believe the actual number could be much higher, possibly exceeding 100 victims. Between 1974 and 1978, he terrorized multiple states across America, leaving behind a trail of shattered families and unanswered questions. What makes Bundy's case particularly fascinating to criminologists and psychologists is not just the brutality of his crimes, but the stark contradiction between his outward appearance and his inner darkness. Bundy didn't fit the stereotypical image of a serial killer. He was handsome, intelligent, and articulate. He attended law school, worked on political campaigns, and volunteered at a crisis hotline. To those who knew him casually, he appeared to be a promising young man with a bright future ahead of him. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lurked something monstrous, something that would eventually reveal itself in the most horrific ways imaginable. This is a story about manipulation, about how someone can wear a mask so convincing that even trained professionals failed to see through it. It's about the failures of law enforcement across multiple jurisdictions, the evolution of criminal investigation techniques, and ultimately about the victims whose lives were cut tragically short by a man who viewed them as nothing more than objects for his gratification. Before we begin our journey into this darkness, it's important to remember that behind every statistic, every crime scene photograph, every court document, there were real people, young women with dreams, with families who loved them, with futures that were stolen from them. As we explore the mind of their killer, we must never lose sight of their humanity. Tonight, we'll trace Ted Bundy's life from his troubled beginnings in Burlington, Vermont, through his formative years in Washington state, to his eventual capture and execution in Florida. We'll examine the psychological factors that may have contributed to his transformation into a killer, explore the specific crimes he committed, and look at how his case changed the landscape of criminal investigation in America. So, settle in, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a deep examination into the life and crimes of one of America's most notorious serial killers. This is the story of Ted Bundy. Part 1: Early Life and the Seeds of Darkness. Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, but the circumstances of his birth would set the stage for a lifetime of deception and identity confusion. He wasn't born as Theodore Robert Bundy at all. His birth name was Theodore Robert Cowell, and he came into the world at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. This facility was a refuge for unmarried pregnant women during an era when having a child out of wedlock carried significant social stigma. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was 22 years old and unmarried when she gave birth to Ted. In the conservative social climate of the 1940s America, this situation brought shame not just to Louise, but to her entire family. The identity of Ted's biological father has never been definitively confirmed, and over the years, various names have been suggested. His original birth certificate listed a Lloyd Marshall as the father, though later versions indicated the father as unknown. Louise herself claimed she had been involved with a man named Jack Worthington, a war veteran who abandoned her when she became pregnant. The mystery surrounding Ted's paternity would deepen over the years. Some family members, including Louise's own siblings, whispered darker suspicions. They suggested that Ted might have been the product of incest, potentially fathered by Louise's own father, Samuel Cowell. This allegation was never proven during Bundy's lifetime, and in 2020, a documentary film claimed that DNA testing had ruled out incest. However, the truth remains murky, and the uncertainty around his origins would become a source of deep psychological pain for Ted as he grew older. For the first 3 years of his life, Ted lived with his maternal grandparents in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. But the arrangement came with a cruel deception designed to protect the family's reputation. Young Ted was told that his grandparents were actually his parents and that his biological mother, Louise, was his older sister. This elaborate lie was maintained to shield the family from social judgment, but it would have profound psychological consequences for Ted. Samuel Cowell, the man Ted believed to be his father, but who was actually his grandfather, has been described in conflicting ways. In 1987, Bundy and other family members told attorneys that Samuel was a tyrannical bully who beat his wife and the family dog, swung neighborhood cats by their tails, and expressed racist and xenophobic attitudes. He reportedly threw his daughter Julia down a flight of stairs for oversleeping and would sometimes speak aloud to unseen presences. However, some neighbors and family members have disputed this characterization, describing Samuel as a well-regarded citizen. Regardless of which account is more accurate, the household environment appears to have been troubled, with secrets and dysfunction that would impact young Ted's development. Ted's grandmother, Eleanor Cowell, suffered from severe depression and underwent electroshock therapy on multiple occasions. She was described as a timid, submissive woman who seemed perpetually afraid. The atmosphere in the Cowell household was troubled, filled with secrets, mental illness, and dysfunction. Young Ted was growing up in an environment that was far from stable or healthy. Some family members later recalled disturbing behavior from Ted even as a very young child. In one particularly chilling incident, when Ted was just 3 years old, his Aunt Julia woke from a nap to find herself surrounded by kitchen knives that had been carefully placed all around her body on the bed. Standing next to the bed, smiling, was little Ted. This story, if true, suggests that even in early childhood, Ted was exhibiting behaviors that should have raised serious alarms. In 1950, when Ted was 4 years old, Louise made the decision to leave Philadelphia and start fresh. She moved with Ted across the country to Tacoma, Washington, where they stayed with relatives. This move represented Louise's attempt to escape her past and build a new life for herself and her son, away from the oppressive atmosphere of her parents' home and the whispers about her illegitimate child. In Tacoma, Louise met Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a hospital cook who worked at a military hospital. Johnny was, by all accounts, a decent and hard-working man. He and Louise married in May 1951, and Johnny legally adopted Ted, giving him the name that would become infamous, Theodore Robert Bundy. Together, Johnny and Louise would go on to have 4 more children, giving Ted several half-siblings. For Ted, the move to Washington and his mother's remarriage should have represented a fresh start, an opportunity to leave behind the dysfunction of his early childhood. But the damage had already been done. The lies about his parentage, the violent environment of his grandfather's home, and whatever genetic or psychological predispositions he might have inherited had already begun to shape his personality in dark ways. Ted's relationship with his stepfather Johnny was complicated. Publicly, he would sometimes speak positively about Johnny, acknowledging that he had been a good father figure, but in private conversations and interviews, a different picture emerged. Ted felt that Johnny was beneath his mother, that he wasn't sophisticated or educated enough. Despite Johnny's kindness and his willingness to accept Ted as his own son, Ted harbored resentment toward him. This sense of superiority, this belief that he was better than the people around him, would become a defining characteristic of Ted's personality. As a child in Tacoma, Ted was shy and somewhat awkward socially. He struggled to fit in with other children and often felt like an outsider. He wasn't particularly athletic, though he was intelligent and did well in school academically. But beneath his quiet exterior, something was developing, something that would eventually express itself in the most destructive ways possible. Ted himself would later describe feeling different from other children, sensing that he didn't experience emotions the same way others did. He spoke of feeling disconnected, of watching other people interact and trying to mimic their behaviors without actually understanding the feelings behind them. This description aligns closely with what psychologists now recognize as psychopathy, a personality disorder characterized by a lack of empathy, manipulativeness, and superficial charm. During his adolescent years in Tacoma, Ted's behavior began to show more obvious warning signs. He developed an interest in peering into windows, watching people in their homes without their knowledge. He began shoplifting, stealing things not out of necessity, but seemingly for the thrill of it. He was also developing an obsessive interest in violent sexual content, reportedly seeking out detective magazines that featured stories about crimes against women. One of the most controversial aspects of Ted's early life involves a possible connection to an unsolved disappearance. In 1961, when Ted was 14 years old, an 8-year-old girl named Anne-Marie Burr vanished from her home in Tacoma. Anne's house was on Ted's newspaper delivery route, and the Bundy family lived just a few blocks away. For years, speculation swirled about whether Ted might have been responsible for Anne's disappearance, though he always denied any involvement. Anne's body was never found, and her case remains unsolved to this day. While there's no definitive proof linking Ted to this crime, the proximity and timing have kept the suspicion alive. As Ted entered his teenage years, he learned the truth about his parentage. The exact circumstances of how he discovered that his sister was actually his mother vary depending on which account you believe. Some sources say he found his birth certificate, while others suggest a cousin revealed the truth during an argument. Regardless of how it happened, the revelation was devastating to Ted. He felt betrayed, humiliated, and angry. The foundation of his identity had been based on a lie, and this discovery deepened his sense of being different, of being somehow damaged. The identity crisis triggered by this revelation would have lasting effects on Ted's psychological development. He became even more focused on crafting a false persona, on creating an image of himself that contradicted his actual origins. He wanted to be seen as sophisticated, educated, from a good family. He worked hard to hide any hint of his working-class background or the shame associated with his illegitimate birth. This obsession with appearance and reputation, with being perceived a certain way regardless of reality, would become central to his personality. By the time Ted graduated from Wilson High School in Tacoma in 1965, he appeared on the surface to be a normal, if somewhat unremarkable, young man. His classmates remembered him as quiet and shy, someone who didn't particularly stand out. But beneath the surface, the psychological groundwork for what he would become was already in place. The childhood trauma, the identity confusion, the lack of genuine emotional connection to others, the early behavioral warning signs, all of these factors were combining to create something dangerous. In the fall of 1965, Ted enrolled at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma. He spent 1 year there before transferring to the University of Washington in Seattle in 1966. This move to Seattle would prove significant, as it was in this city that Ted would eventually begin his killing spree. But that was still several years away. For now, Ted was focused on reinventing himself, on becoming the person he wanted others to believe he was. During his college years, Ted's personality continued to develop along its troubling trajectory. He was charming when he wanted to be, capable of making good first impressions. He could be funny and engaging in conversation, but these social skills were learned behaviors, carefully studied and practiced rather than natural expressions of genuine feeling. Ted was like an actor playing a role, and he was getting better at it with each passing year. Part 2: College Years and the Woman Who Changed Everything. When Ted Bundy arrived at the University of Washington in Seattle in 1966, he was a young man determined to remake himself. Gone was the shy, awkward teenager from Tacoma. In his place was someone more confident, more polished, someone who could navigate social situations with surprising ease. Ted majored in psychology, a choice that seems almost darkly ironic in retrospect. He was studying the human mind, while his own was developing into that of a predator. It was during his time at the University of Washington that Ted met Stephanie Brooks, the woman who would have perhaps the most profound impact on his life. Stephanie came from a wealthy California family. She was beautiful, sophisticated, and everything Ted aspired to be associated with. She represented the upper-class world that Ted desperately wanted to be part of, the world that seemed to validate his carefully constructed new identity. Ted and Stephanie began dating in 1967, and for Ted, this relationship became an obsession. He was intensely focused on impressing her, on proving that he was worthy of someone from her social standing. He wanted her to see him as sophisticated and cultured, someone with ambition and promise. For a while, it seemed to work. They were together for several years, spending time together at school and during visits to her family in California. But Stephanie began to see through Ted's facade. She recognized that beneath the surface charm, there was something missing. Ted seemed directionless, lacking in ambition despite his talk of future success. He didn't have clear career goals, and his plans for the future seemed vague and unrealistic. More troubling, Stephanie sensed an emotional emptiness in Ted, a lack of genuine depth to his feelings despite his passionate declarations. In 1968, Stephanie broke up with Ted. The breakup devastated him in a way that nothing else had. He became depressed, withdrawn, and unable to focus on his studies. His grades dropped dramatically. He felt rejected and humiliated, convinced that Stephanie had abandoned him because he wasn't good enough, because he came from a lower social class, because he was fundamentally inadequate. This rejection would fester inside him, transforming into a bitter resentment toward women, particularly women who resembled Stephanie. After the breakup, Ted dropped out of the University of Washington and entered a period of aimless wandering. He traveled to California, worked various jobs, and seemed unable to settle on a direction for his life. During this time, he also made a trip to Philadelphia to meet his biological father, or at least the man whose name appeared on his birth certificate. The visit apparently didn't go well, and Ted returned to the West Coast without having found any answers about his origins. In 1969, while in California, Ted became involved with another woman, but this relationship was brief and apparently unremarkable. Some criminologists have speculated that Ted may have committed his first murder around this time. He himself later made cryptic comments suggesting that his violent crimes began earlier than anyone knew. In conversations with investigators, he hinted at murders in 1969, possibly in Atlantic City, while visiting family in Philadelphia and possibly in California. These claims were never verified, but they raise the disturbing possibility that Ted's killing spree began much earlier than the 1974 date that's traditionally cited. By 1970, Ted had returned to Washington and was ready to make another attempt at building the life he wanted. He re-enrolled at the University of Washington and threw himself into his studies with renewed focus. He was charming and personable, making friends easily and impressing his professors. He joined various clubs and organizations on campus, building a network of connections that would later make it difficult for people to believe he could be capable of violence. It was during this period that Ted began volunteering at the Seattle Crisis Clinic, a suicide prevention hotline. This might seem like an odd choice for someone who would later show such complete disregard for human life, but for Ted, it served multiple purposes. It allowed him to appear compassionate and caring, reinforcing his carefully constructed image as a good person. It also gave him an opportunity to study human emotion and vulnerability, to learn how to better manipulate people's feelings. One of his fellow volunteers at the crisis clinic was Anne Rule, a former police officer who was working on becoming a true crime writer. Anne and Ted became friends, and she would later write one of the most influential books about him, The Stranger Beside Me. Anne's unique perspective as someone who knew Ted personally before discovering he was a killer would provide crucial insights into his ability to deceive. In 1972, Ted graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in psychology. His academic performance had improved dramatically from his earlier struggles, and he graduated with distinction. He was intelligent and capable when he applied himself, and he used his achievements to further bolster his image as someone who was destined for success. After graduation, Ted became involved in Washington state politics. He worked on political campaigns and impressed people with his dedication and hard work. He was articulate and persuasive, able to craft compelling arguments and connect with voters. His involvement in politics gave him visibility and credibility, making him seem like an upstanding member of the community. During this time, he was even commended by the Seattle Police Department for chasing down and helping to apprehend a purse snatcher. The irony of this is almost unbearable. A future serial killer being praised by police for helping catch a petty thief. But perhaps the most significant development during this period was Ted's reunion with Stephanie Brooks. Ted had been working on himself since their breakup, building his resume, polishing his image, and planning his revenge. He reached out to Stephanie, and to her surprise, he seemed like a changed man. He was confident, successful, and seemed to have direction in his life. They began dating again, and Ted appeared to be everything Stephanie had once wanted him to be. Then, suddenly, and without warning, Ted broke up with Stephanie. He did it coldly, cruelly, leaving her confused and hurt. Some who have studied Bundy's psychology believed this was a calculated act of revenge, a way to make Stephanie feel the rejection and humiliation he had felt years earlier. After dumping her, Ted essentially disappeared from her life, never providing an explanation for his sudden change of heart. He had shown her that he was worthy of her, then rejected her when she was vulnerable. It was a power play, a demonstration of control that seemed to give Ted satisfaction. This incident reveals something crucial about Ted's psychology. He wasn't just hurt by rejection. He needed to inflict that same pain on others, needed to demonstrate his power over them. The ability to manipulate someone's emotions, to make them feel loss and confusion, seemed to provide him with a sense of satisfaction that normal emotional connections couldn't give him. This need for power and control, this desire to hurt others as a way of validating his own importance, would soon express itself in far more terrible ways. In 1973, Ted enrolled at the University of Puget Sound School of Law. He seemed to be on track for a successful legal career, studying diligently and performing well in his classes. But beneath this facade of normalcy, something was changing. The violent fantasies that had been gestating in Ted's mind for years were becoming harder to control. The pornography he had been consuming, which often featured violent and sadistic content, was no longer enough to satisfy him. He needed something more real, more visceral. Around this time, Ted also met Elizabeth Clofer, a divorced mother who would become his long-term girlfriend. Elizabeth was intelligent and attractive, with long dark hair parted in the middle, a look that would become tragically significant as Ted's crimes unfolded. Ted and Elizabeth developed what appeared to be a genuine relationship. They spent time together. He helped care for her daughter, and to all outward appearances, they were a normal couple. Elizabeth would later describe feeling that Ted truly loved her, that there were moments when she saw real emotion from him. But Elizabeth also noticed troubling signs. Ted would disappear for hours or days without explanation. He had medical equipment and other strange items in his apartment that he couldn't adequately explain. He would sometimes become cold and distant, seeming to withdraw into himself in ways that frightened her. And on at least one occasion, she woke to find Ted looking at her body in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable, as if he were examining an object rather than looking at someone he cared about. By early 1974, Ted was living a double life. On one hand, he was a law student with a girlfriend, a man who volunteered to help people in crisis and worked on political campaigns. On the other, he was prowling the streets of Seattle, stalking women, learning their routines, and fantasizing about violence. The facade he had so carefully constructed was beginning to crack, not because he was making mistakes, but because the compulsion to act on his violent urges was becoming overwhelming. The trigger for what would become his known killing spree is difficult to pinpoint. Some have suggested it was related to his complicated feelings about women, stemming from his relationship with Stephanie Brooks and his mother's deceptions. Others point to his narcissism and need for power, his desire to have complete control over another person. Some criminologists believe his crimes were sexually motivated, driven by deviant fantasies that had been developing since adolescence. In truth, it was likely a combination of all these factors, creating a perfect storm that would soon unleash terror across the Pacific Northwest. In January 1974, Ted Bundy would cross the line from fantasy to action. He would commit his first confirmed attack, and in doing so, begin a horrific series of crimes that would eventually claim at least 30 lives. The quiet psychology student, the helpful political volunteer, the friendly crisis hotline worker, all of these were about to be revealed as masks worn by a monster. Part 3. The first attacks in Seattle. The winter of 1974 was when Ted Bundy's violent fantasies finally manifested into brutal reality. For years, he had been stalking women, learning their routines, perfecting his techniques. He had been breaking into homes, possibly even before his known crimes began. But on January 4th, 1974, he crossed a line from which there would be no return. 18-year-old Caryn Sparks was a student at the University of Washington, living in a basement apartment in Seattle's University District. In the early morning hours of January 4th, Ted Bundy broke into her apartment while she slept. Using a metal rod from her own bed frame, he bludgeoned her viciously. The attack was so savage that Caryn's skull was fractured in multiple places. But Bundy didn't stop there. He sexually assaulted her with the same metal rod he had used to beat her. Caryn Sparks survived, but the injuries she sustained left her in a coma for 10 days. When she finally regained consciousness, she had no memory of the attack and would suffer from permanent physical and cognitive disabilities for the rest of her life. The randomness and brutality of the attack sent shockwaves through the University of Washington community. Police had almost nothing to work with, no witnesses, minimal physical evidence, and a victim who couldn't identify her attacker. This first attack established the pattern that Bundy would follow for his early crimes. He targeted young women, often students, usually with long dark hair parted down the middle. He would break into their homes while they slept, attack them with savage violence, and sexually assault them. The brutality seemed almost frenzied, suggesting a rage that had been building for years and was now finally being expressed. Exactly 1 month after the attack on Caryn Sparks, on February 1st, 1974, 21-year-old Lynda Healy disappeared from her basement apartment in the University District. Lynda was a psychology major at the University of Washington and worked as a ski conditions announcer for a local radio station. She was last seen by her roommates the evening of January 31st, seemingly preparing for bed. When her roommates woke the next morning, Lynda was gone. The scene in Lynda's room was deeply disturbing. Her bed had been carefully made, the covers pulled tight and smooth. But when police examined the bed more closely, they found bloodstains on the pillow and sheets. Her nightgown was hanging in the closet, apparently removed and carefully put away. Investigators found bloodstains on the nightgown as well, suggesting that Lynda had been attacked while sleeping, just like Caryn Sparks. But in this case, the attacker had taken his victim with him, along with some of her clothes. Ted Bundy had entered Lynda's room while she slept, bludgeoned her into unconsciousness, dressed her in street clothes, and carried her away. The calculated nature of this crime, the way Bundy had taken the time to redress his victim and make the bed, suggested a killer who was organized and methodical. This wasn't a crime of passion or impulse. This was carefully planned and executed with chilling precision. Lynda Healy's disappearance sent the University District into a panic. Young women started taking precautions, traveling in groups, making sure doors and windows were locked. But they were facing a predator who was patient and intelligent, someone who could adapt his techniques and wait for the right opportunity. And opportunities kept presenting themselves. Over the next few months, more young women would disappear from Washington state. On March 12, 1974, 19-year-old Donna Gail Manson vanished from Evergreen State College in Olympia. She had left her dormitory to attend an on-campus concert and was never seen again. Unlike the previous victims, Donna's body was never recovered, and for years, law enforcement didn't even know if she had been murdered or had simply run away. On April the 17th, 1974, Susan Elaine Rancourt disappeared from Central Washington State College in Ellensburg. Susan was last seen leaving her dorm to go to a movie. Witnesses later reported seeing a young man with his arm in a sling asking for help carrying books to his car. This was the first indication of one of Bundy's most effective tactics, feigning injury or disability to appear non-threatening and to appeal to women's natural compassion. Roberta Kathleen Parks disappeared from Oregon State University in Corvallis on May 6, 1974. Brenda Carroll Ball vanished from a tavern in Burien, Washington on June 1, 1974. Georgann Hawkins disappeared from the University of Washington campus on June 11, 1974. The disappearances were happening with increasing frequency, and law enforcement was struggling to connect the cases. Each victim had vanished without a trace, leaving behind almost no evidence. But July 14, 1974, would prove to be a turning point in the investigation. That day was sunny and warm, and thousands of people flocked to Lake Sammamish State Park, a popular recreational area east of Seattle. The park was crowded with families, couples, and groups of friends enjoying the summer weather. Among the crowd was Ted Bundy, and he was hunting. 23-year-old Janice Ott arrived at the park around noon. She spread out a blanket and settled in to sunbathe. Witnesses later reported seeing a handsome young man approach her. He was wearing his arm in a sling and asked if she could help him load a sailboat onto his car. Several people overheard him introduce himself as Ted. Janice agreed to help and walked away with the man. She was never seen alive again. That same afternoon, 19-year-old Denise Naslund arrived at the park with her boyfriend and friends. Around 4:30 p.m., Denise excused herself to use the restroom. She never returned. Her boyfriend and friends searched frantically but couldn't find her. Like Janice Ott, Denise had simply vanished. The disappearance of two women from the same crowded public place on the same day finally gave investigators the break they needed. Multiple witnesses described the handsome young man with his arm in a sling. He had been driving a brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle, and crucially, he had repeatedly introduced himself as Ted. These details would prove invaluable, though it would still be more than a year before Ted Bundy would be arrested. Law enforcement agencies across Washington state now understood that they were dealing with a serial killer. The similarities among the victims were impossible to ignore. They were all young women, mostly in their late teens or early 20s. They all had long hair, usually dark, parted in the middle. They were all attractive and appeared to be responsible, low-risk victims, not the type who would willingly go with a stranger without good reason. And they had all disappeared without any sign of a struggle or any substantial physical evidence left behind. The King County Police Department formed a special task force to investigate what was quickly becoming one of the most challenging serial murder cases in American history. Detective Robert Keppel, a young but talented investigator, was assigned to lead much of the investigative work. Keppel and his team faced an enormous challenge. They had multiple missing persons cases, but initially no bodies and no crime scenes. Without physical evidence, they were left trying to find patterns in the disappearances themselves. The task force began compiling detailed victim profiles. They mapped out where each woman had last been seen, looking for geographic patterns. They created timelines, trying to determine if there were specific days of the week or times of day when the killer was most active. They interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses, trying to piece together descriptions of suspicious individuals or vehicles seen near the locations where women had vanished. As more disappearances occurred, the task force grew. Investigators from multiple jurisdictions were pulled in to help with the massive amount of work. Tips poured in from the public after media coverage of the cases. The composite sketch from the Lake Sammamish witnesses was published in newspapers and shown on television. People were asked to call in if they knew anyone who resembled the sketch, drove a tan or brown Volkswagen Beetle, and went by the name Ted. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of tips flooded the police phone lines. Investigators worked around the clock, trying to follow up on leads, but they were drowning in information. Every Volkswagen owner in the region seemed to be a potential suspect. Every man named Ted or Theodore was looked at. The lists grew longer and longer, and buried within them, reported by multiple people, was Theodore Robert Bundy. Detective Campbell later said that one of the most frustrating aspects of the investigation was knowing that they probably had the killer's name somewhere in their files, but with so many suspects and so little concrete evidence, it was impossible to know which one to focus on. They developed a scoring system, trying to prioritize suspects based on how many factors matched the known characteristics of the killer. But even with this system, Ted Bundy didn't rise to the top of the list. His clean record, his work with the crisis clinic, his involvement in legitimate political campaigns, all of these things made him seem less likely than many other suspects. The investigation was also hampered by a lack of understanding about serial killers. In 1974, the concept of a serial killer as a specific type of criminal was still relatively new. The FBI's Behavioral Sciences Unit was in its early stages. Profiling techniques were rudimentary. Investigators were dealing with a type of crime and a type of criminal that law enforcement hadn't fully learned how to investigate yet. When the first bodies were discovered at the Issaquah burial site in September 1974, the investigation intensified. Now they had crime scenes, even though the bodies had been there for months, and much evidence had been destroyed by weather and wildlife. Forensic teams carefully excavated the site, searching for any physical evidence that might point to the killer. They found evidence of sexual assault. They found evidence that the killer had returned to the site multiple times, but they found no fingerprints, no useful tire tracks, no clear evidence that would lead them directly to a suspect. The discovery of the burial site did confirm that the victims had likely been taken to a secondary location, killed there, and then their bodies transported to the burial site. This suggested a killer who had access to a vehicle and who knew the area well enough to find isolated locations where he wouldn't be disturbed. It also suggested a level of planning and organization that made the crimes even more chilling. Investigators began to understand they were dealing with someone highly intelligent and methodical. This wasn't a disorganized killer leaving obvious clues. This was someone who planned his crimes carefully, who took steps to avoid leaving evidence, and who was learning from each crime and becoming more proficient. Investigators began compiling lists of possible suspects. They gathered names of Volkswagen owners in the region. They cross-referenced these with men named Ted or Theodore. They interviewed sex offenders and anyone with a history of violence against women. The lists contained thousands of names, and buried among them, almost lost in the sheer volume of data, was the name Ted Bundy. Multiple people had actually called in tips about Ted Bundy. His girlfriend, Elizabeth Clover, contacted police after seeing a wanted poster of the composite sketch based on witness descriptions from Lake Sammamish. She thought it looked like Ted and knew he drove a Volkswagen Beetle. But she was conflicted, unable to fully accept that the man she loved could be responsible for such terrible crimes. Anne Rule, Ted's friend from the crisis hotline, also saw the sketch and felt uneasy about its resemblance to Ted. She didn't report it initially, but kept the uncomfortable suspicion in the back of her mind. One of Ted's University of Washington professors also contacted police, suggesting that Ted Bundy fit the general description. But with so many tips coming in, and with Ted's seemingly respectable background, he wasn't immediately prioritized as a suspect. He was included on the list, but he was just one name among thousands. His clean record, his work with the crisis clinic, his involvement in politics, all of these things made it difficult for investigators to see him as a viable suspect. In September 1974, grouse hunters made a grim discovery near Issaquah, Washington. In a wooded area off a rarely traveled road, they found human remains. Investigators soon determined that the site contained the remains of multiple victims. Janice and Denise Naslund, the two women who had disappeared from Lake Sammamish, were identified. So was Georgann Hawkins. A fourth skull was found, but couldn't be immediately identified. The discovery of this burial site provided investigators with crucial information about the killer's methods. The location was isolated but accessible, suggesting that the killer knew the area well. The remains showed signs of sexual assault and showed that the killer had returned to the site multiple times after the initial murders. This fit the pattern of an organized serial killer, someone who was methodical, patient, and disturbed enough to revisit his victims even after they were dead. But even as investigators in Washington were beginning to piece together evidence about their unknown killer, Ted Bundy was already moving on. In September 1974, he enrolled at the University of Utah College of Law in Salt Lake City. He left Seattle behind, left Elizabeth Clover behind, and began a new chapter of his life. And he brought his murderous compulsions with him. The string of disappearances in Washington came to an abrupt end in late 1974, right around the time Ted left for Utah. This sudden cessation of crimes in the Seattle area, while similar crimes began in Utah, should have been a major clue. But law enforcement agencies in different states weren't effectively sharing information, and it would take more deaths before anyone made the connection. Part 4: The Utah Killings and a Crucial Mistake. When Ted Bundy arrived in Salt Lake City in the fall of 1974 to attend the University of Utah College of Law, he appeared to be starting fresh. He enrolled in classes, found an apartment, and seemed to be settling into his new life as a law student. But the move to Utah didn't represent an escape from his violent compulsions. Instead, it simply meant that his crimes would now be committed in a new jurisdiction, making it even harder for law enforcement to connect the dots. Ted wasted little time before resuming his killing spree in Utah. On October 2nd, 1974, 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox disappeared from Holiday, a suburb of Salt Lake City. Nancy was walking home from a school event when she vanished. Ted Bundy would later confess to killing Nancy, stating that he buried her body in a remote location approximately 200 miles from Salt Lake City. Her remains have never been recovered. 2 weeks later, on October 18, 1974, 17-year-old Melissa Smith disappeared from Midvale, Utah. Melissa was the daughter of Midvale Police Chief Louis Smith, a detail that made the case particularly high profile and added pressure on investigators to solve it. Melissa had been at a pizza parlor with friends and was walking home when she was abducted. Her body was discovered 9 days later in a canyon near Summit Park, Utah. The condition of Melissa's body indicated she had been held alive for at least a day before being killed. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. On October 31st, 1974, 17-year-old Laura Ann Aime disappeared from Lehi, Utah, after attending a Halloween party. Her body was found on Thanksgiving Day in American Fork Canyon. Like Melissa Smith, Laura had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. The brutality of these murders was escalating. Ted wasn't just killing quickly anymore, he was taking time with his victims, holding them captive, torturing them. The attacks continued with shocking frequency. On November 8, 1974, Carol DeRonch had an encounter that she would barely survive and that would ultimately help bring Ted Bundy to justice. Carol was 18 years old and had just left the Fashion Place Mall in Murray, Utah, when she was approached by a man claiming to be a police officer. The man told her that someone had attempted to break into her car and asked her to accompany him to the police station to file a report. Carol was initially suspicious, but the man seemed official and knowledgeable. He even showed her what appeared to be a police badge. She got into his Volkswagen Beetle, but as they were driving, she realized they weren't heading toward the police station. When the man pulled into a dark area and attempted to handcuff her, Carol fought back with everything she had. She managed to partially escape from the handcuffs and threw herself out of the moving car. The man chased after her, but Carol screamed for help and flagged down a passing car. Her attacker fled, and Carol DeRonch survived to tell her harrowing story. She was able to provide police with a detailed description of her attacker and his car. This description matched the composite sketch from the Lake Sammamish cases in Washington, though investigators in Utah and Washington weren't yet sharing information effectively. That same evening, a few hours after the attempted abduction of Carol DeRonch, 17-year-old Deborah Kent disappeared from Vermont High School in Bountiful, Utah, where she had been attending a school play with her parents. Witnesses at the school reported seeing a strange man asking for help, claiming to need assistance finding his car. Deborah left the auditorium during intermission and never returned. A small bone that would later be identified as Deborah's was found near the high school, but the rest of her remains were never recovered. The murders continued into 1975. In Colorado, 4 women would disappear between January and April. Caryn Campbell from Snowmass Village, Julie Cunningham from Vail, Denise Oliverson from Grand Junction, and Nancy Baird from Farmington. The pattern was consistent young women with long dark hair, victims who were attractive and appeared responsible, abducted from public places or their homes with minimal evidence left behind. But Ted Bundy's luck was about to run out. On August 16, 1975, a Utah Highway Patrol officer named Bob Haywood was on duty in the early morning hours in Granger, a suburb of Salt Lake City. Around 2:30 a.m., Haywood noticed a Volkswagen Beetle driving through a residential neighborhood with its headlights off. When Haywood tried to pull the car over, the driver sped away, running a stop sign before finally pulling over. The driver was Ted Bundy. When Officer Haywood approached the car to question Ted about why he had run, Ted's explanations were vague and unconvincing. He claimed he had been at a drive-in movie and had gotten lost trying to find his way home. but Haywood's instincts told him something was wrong. He asked permission to search the vehicle, and what he found was deeply suspicious. In the Volkswagen, Officer Haywood discovered handcuffs, a ski mask, rope, an ice pick, and other items that had no innocent explanation. The passenger seat had been removed and was placed in the back seat. There was also a crowbar. When questioned about these items, Ted claimed the handcuffs were for kinky sex and that the other items were just things he had lying around in his car. But the explanation didn't satisfy Haywood, who arrested Ted on suspicion of burglary. Ted was released on bail, but the items found in his car had caught the attention of detectives investigating the recent disappearances. They obtained a search warrant for Ted's apartment and found more disturbing evidence. They found a brochure for a summer resort in Colorado where one of the victims had disappeared. They found a gas receipt placing Ted in the area where another victim had vanished. They found photographs and maps that seemed to correspond to locations where bodies had been discovered or where women had gone missing. Detective Jerry Thompson of the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office began to seriously investigate Ted Bundy as a suspect in the Utah murders. Thompson contacted law enforcement in Washington and Colorado, and the pieces began falling into place. The cases in multiple states had similar victim profiles, similar methods of abduction, and similar timelines, and Ted Bundy's movements corresponded remarkably well with the geographic and temporal distribution of the crimes. Most significantly, Carol DeRonch, the young woman who had escaped from Ted in November 1974, was shown a photo lineup that included Ted's picture. She immediately identified him as the man who had attempted to abduct her. This gave investigators the evidence they needed to charge Ted with attempted kidnapping and assault. Ted's trial for the attempted kidnapping of Carol DeRonch began in February 1976. Ted waived his right to a jury trial, choosing instead to have his case decided by a judge. This decision would prove to be a mistake. Judge Stuart Hansen Jr. heard testimony from Carol DeRonch, who made a convincing and credible witness despite her obvious nervousness. She described in detail her terrifying encounter with Ted, her voice sometimes barely above a whisper, but her identification unwavering. Ted chose to testify in his own defense, a decision that showcased both his confidence and his narcissism. He was articulate and presented himself well, but Judge Hansen wasn't fooled. On March 1st, 1976, Judge Hansen found Ted Bundy guilty of aggravated kidnapping. He was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in Utah State Prison. But this conviction was just the beginning. As Ted sat in prison, detectives from multiple states were building cases against him for murder. Evidence was being collected, witness statements were being compared, and physical evidence from crime scenes was being re-examined. Ted Bundy's career as a serial killer was finally catching up with him, though the worst was yet to come. Part 5: Escapes and the Florida Murders. While Ted Bundy sat in Utah State Prison serving his sentence for the kidnapping of Carol DeRonch, investigators in Colorado were building a case against him for the murder of Caryn Campbell. Caryn had disappeared from the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass Village, Colorado, in January 1975. Her body had been found a month later, and physical evidence from the crime scene suggested Ted might be responsible. In October 1976, Ted was extradited to Colorado to face murder charges. He was held in the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, a small facility where security was relatively lax compared to the prison in Utah. Ted, who had been studying law, represented himself during pre-trial hearings. This allowed him certain privileges, including access to the law library without being handcuffed or closely supervised. On June 7, 1977, during a court hearing, Ted was allowed to go to the courthouse library to research his case. Guards waited outside while Ted worked inside. But Ted had no intention of staying in that library. He had noticed during previous visits that one of the library windows was unlocked. When the guards weren't looking, Ted jumped out of the second-story window, injuring his ankle slightly in the process. Once outside, Ted simply walked away. He was wearing street clothes under his prison outfit, having planned this escape carefully. He jogged through the streets of Aspen, eventually hitchhiking and making his way into the mountains. For 6 days, Ted Bundy was loose in Colorado, while police conducted an extensive manhunt. The escape captivated the nation. Here was a handsome, intelligent law student turned suspected serial killer who had literally jumped out of a window and run away. The media coverage was intense, with Ted's photo appearing on television and in newspapers across the country. Tips poured in, but most led nowhere. Ted managed to stay hidden for 6 days by camping in the mountains and occasionally breaking into cabins for food and supplies. But he wasn't equipped for an extended period in the wilderness. He was cold, hungry, and his injured ankle was making it difficult to move. On June 13, 1977, Ted was spotted by police officers and recaptured. He was returned to jail, this time with much tighter security. Or so everyone thought. Ted was moved to the Garfield County Jail and placed in a cell on the top floor. Security was increased, but Ted had been studying the building's layout and had noticed a weakness. The ceiling of his cell was made of welded steel plates, but the welds weren't as strong as they should have been. Ted began working on loosening one of the plates, using materials he had in his cell. It took months of patient work, but by late December 1977, he had created an opening large enough to crawl through. On December 30th, 1977, Ted put his escape plan into action. He had been losing weight deliberately, making himself thin enough to fit through the small opening he had created. The guards had a head count at 10:30 p.m., and Ted made sure he was visible in his cell at that time. But after the guards left, Ted piled books and clothing under his blanket to create the appearance of a sleeping body. Then, he climbed up into the crawl space above his cell. Ted crawled through the ceiling space until he reached an area above the jailer's apartment, which was located in the same building. The jailer and his wife were out for the evening, celebrating New Year's Eve. Ted dropped down into their apartment, changed into civilian clothes he had stolen from the jailer's closet, and simply walked out the front door. By the time his absence was discovered the next day, Ted had a 16-hour head start. This time, Ted didn't stay in Colorado. He made his way to Chicago, then to Michigan, and finally to Atlanta, Georgia. From Atlanta, he traveled to Tallahassee, Florida, arriving on January 8, 1978. Ted was now using the name Chris Hagen and was supporting himself through credit card fraud and petty theft. He rented a room near the Florida State University campus and began living an almost normal life. He even applied for jobs and seemed to be trying to establish himself in Tallahassee, but the compulsion to kill was still there, perhaps stronger than ever. Ted had been in custody for nearly 2 years, unable to act on his violent urges. Now that he was free, the pent-up desire for violence was overwhelming, and he was no longer being as careful as he once had been. Perhaps the stress of being a fugitive, combined with the deterioration of his psychological state, meant that he could no longer maintain the patient, methodical approach he had used in his earlier crimes. On January 14, 1978, Just 6 days after arriving in Tallahassee, Ted Bundy struck. The Chi Omega sorority house was located at 661 West Jefferson Street, just a few blocks from the FSU campus. It was a large, beautiful house that was home to about 40 young women. Around 2:45 a.m. on January 15th, a man was seen entering the Chi Omega house through a back door that had a faulty lock. What happened next represents perhaps the most brutal and frenzied attack in Ted Bundy's known career. Moving quickly through the house, Ted entered the rooms of sleeping women and attacked them with savage violence. He used a log or a club of some kind, striking his victims repeatedly on the head. He sexually assaulted them, bit them, and moved from room to room with horrifying speed. 21-year-old Margaret Bowman was found in her room, beaten to death with such force that her skull was fractured. She had been strangled with a nylon stocking. 20-year-old Levy was found in her room, also beaten and strangled. Her injuries were so severe that they included a deep bite mark on her buttock and evidence of sexual assault with a foreign object, later identified as a hairspray bottle. 2 other Chi Omega sisters, Caryn Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, were attacked in their rooms but survived. Both had been beaten while they slept, suffering severe injuries including broken bones and lacerations, but both managed to survive the attack. Another sorority member heard unusual noises and went to investigate, possibly interrupting Ted and preventing further deaths. Around 3 a.m., only blocks from the Chi Omega house, Ted broke into the apartment of Cheryl Thomas, another FSU student. He attacked her in her sleep, beating her with a club. Cheryl survived, but suffered permanent injuries, including hearing loss and severe balance problems. She was found later that morning by neighbors who had heard unusual sounds from her apartment. The Chi Omega murders shocked the nation. The brutality, the fact that it happened in a sorority house with so many potential witnesses, the speed and violence of the attack, all of these factors made it clear that the killer was devolving, losing whatever control he once had. Police had few leads, but they knew they were looking for someone extremely dangerous. Ted remained in Tallahassee for a few more weeks, but he was growing increasingly unstable. On February 8, 1978, he attempted to abduct a 14-year-old girl named Leslie Parmenter in Jacksonville, but she escaped when her brother intervened. That same day, Ted kidnapped 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach from her junior high school in Lake City, Florida. Kimberly was last seen leaving her homeroom class to retrieve a purse she had forgotten. A PE teacher saw her get into a van driven by an unidentified man. Kimberly's disappearance sparked an intensive search, but she was already dead. Ted had taken her to an abandoned farm building where he sexually assaulted and murdered her. Her body wasn't discovered until April 7, 1978, found in a state of advanced decomposition in a shed near Suwannee River State Park. The murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach marked a departure from Ted's usual victim profile. She was much younger than most of his victims, and the crime seemed even more impulsive and poorly planned than the Chi Omega attacks. It was as if Ted was completely unraveling, no longer capable of the careful planning that had allowed him to evade capture for so long. On February 15, 1978, Ted was driving a stolen Volkswagen Beetle through Pensacola when he was pulled over by police officer David Lee for having stolen license plates. When Lee approached the vehicle, Ted tried to flee, and a struggle ensued. Officer Lee eventually subdued Ted and took him into custody. Initially, Ted refused to identify himself, but when his fingerprints were run, his true identity was confirmed. Ted Bundy, escaped murderer, and one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives, was finally in custody for good. Part 6. The Trials. Ted Bundy's trial for the Chi Omega murders began on June 25, 1979, in Miami, Florida. The trial had been moved from Tallahassee due to the extensive pre-trial publicity that made it impossible to seat an impartial jury locally. The trial would become a media sensation, the first to be televised nationally in the United States. More than 200 reporters from around the world descended on Miami to cover the proceedings. Ted had been assigned a team of public defenders, but in characteristic fashion, he insisted on being heavily involved in his own defense. He had the legal right to represent himself, and while he had attorneys assisting him, Ted frequently took control during the trial, questioning witnesses and making legal arguments. To observers, this seemed like a terrible strategic decision. Ted was intelligent and had studied law, but he was not an experienced attorney, and his narcissism often blinded him to the reality of his situation. The judge presiding over the trial was Edward Cowart, an experienced jurist who would develop a strangely complex relationship with Ted during the proceedings. Judge Cowart seemed to have a grudging respect for Ted's intelligence, even as he recognized the evil of what Ted had done. This relationship would culminate in one of the most memorable moments in the history of American criminal trials. The prosecution's case was built on several key pieces of evidence. Nita Neary, a Chi Omega resident, testified that she had returned to the sorority house in the early morning hours of January 15, 1978, and had seen a man leaving the house carrying a log or club. She had gotten a clear look at his profile and could describe his clothing and general appearance. When shown photographs of suspects, Nita positively identified Ted Bundy as the man she had seen. Nita Neary's testimony was crucial, but it came at a personal cost. She had to relive the trauma of that night in front of a packed courtroom and television cameras broadcasting to the nation. She described in detail the moment she realized something was terribly wrong, the fear she felt seeing the man leaving the house, and the horror of discovering her sorority sisters brutally attacked. Her voice shook at times, but she maintained her composure, and her identification of Bundy remained firm under aggressive cross-examination by the defense. Connie Hastings, another Chi Omega member, testified that she had seen Ted Bundy in the area of the sorority house on the night of the murders. Her testimony placed Ted at the scene around the time the attacks occurred, corroborating Nita Neary's identification. The defense tried to suggest that Hastings was mistaken, that she had been influenced by media coverage and police suggestions, but her testimony was consistent and detailed enough to be persuasive to the jury. The prosecution team, led by Larry Simpson, had spent months preparing their case. They knew they were facing a defendant who was intelligent, who had studied law, and who would be actively involved in his own defense. Simpson and his team anticipated every possible defense strategy, prepared responses to expected objections, and assembled their evidence in a way that would be clear and compelling to jurors who might not understand complex forensic science. The decision to allow television cameras in the courtroom was controversial. Judge Cowart believed that the public had a right to see justice being done and that the transparency of a televised trial would serve the public interest. But this decision also turned the trial into a media spectacle. Reporters filled the courtroom every day, Cameras captured every moment, every expression on Bundy's face, every dramatic point made by the attorneys. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, some drawn by curiosity, others seeking a glimpse of the infamous killer. For the families of Bundy's victims, the trial was an excruciating experience. Margaret Bowman's parents and Lisa Levy's parents were present for much of the trial, forced to sit through graphic testimony about what had happened to their daughters. They had to look at photographs of the crime scene. They had to hear medical examiners describe in clinical detail the injuries their daughters had suffered. The defense's strategy of challenging every piece of evidence meant that the families had to endure this repeatedly, as details were gone over again and again. The parents of other victims, women who had disappeared in Washington, Utah, and Colorado, also followed the trial closely. For many of them, this was the only chance they would ever have to see Ted Bundy face justice. He had never been charged in many of those cases and likely never would be. The statute of limitations hadn't run out, but prosecutors in Florida were focused on the cases they could prove beyond a reasonable doubt. These other families could only watch and hope that justice in Florida would provide some measure of closure for their own losses. The emotional toll on everyone involved in the trial was immense. Jurors who had been carefully selected and sequestered to avoid media contamination had to view graphic photographs and listen to disturbing testimony day after day. Court personnel who typically handled routine criminal cases found themselves working on something that felt historically significant but also deeply troubling. The judge himself, despite his experience, later spoke about the difficulty of maintaining judicial composure while presiding over a case of such depravity. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from forensic odontology, the science of comparing dental impressions. Lisa Levy's body had shown a distinctive bite mark on her buttock. Photographs of the bite mark had been taken during the autopsy, and these photographs were compared with dental impressions taken from Ted Bundy. Dr. Richard Souveron, a forensic odontologist, testified that the bite mark on Lisa Levy's body matched Ted's teeth with a high degree of certainty. This was relatively new science in criminal trials, and the defense objected strenuously to its admission. But Judge Cowart allowed the testimony, and the jury was shown enlarged photographs comparing the bite mark to Ted's dental impressions. The match was visually compelling, even to laypeople who knew nothing about forensic dentistry. The images showed the distinctive irregularities in Ted's teeth lining up with the marks on Lisa Levy's body. Ted's defense was largely ineffective. He tried to suggest that the evidence was circumstantial and that the scientific testimony about the bite mark was unreliable. He attempted to portray himself as a victim of circumstantial evidence and media prejudice. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, and his attempts to defend himself often came across as arrogant and unpersuasive. The prosecution also introduced evidence about Ted's background, his previous conviction in Utah, and his escapes from custody. While some of this evidence might have been excluded in a different trial, Judge Cowart allowed it, ruling that it was relevant to establishing identity and pattern of behavior. Ted chose not to testify in his own defense during the guilt phase of the trial, a decision that surprised many observers. Throughout his arrest and during pre-trial proceedings, Ted had been vocal about his innocence, and many expected him to take the stand to defend himself. But his attorneys advised against it, knowing that Ted's narcissism and tendency to manipulate might not play well with the jury. After 6 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury on July 23rd, 1979. The deliberations lasted less than 7 hours. The jury found Ted Bundy guilty on all counts: 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Margaret Bowman and Levy, 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder for the attacks on Caryn Chandler, Kathy Kleiner, and Cheryl Thomas, and 2 counts of burglary. The penalty phase of the trial began immediately. Under Florida law, the jury would recommend a sentence, and the judge would make the final determination. The prosecution argued forcefully for the death penalty, emphasizing the brutal nature of the crimes and the danger Ted posed to society. The defense presented mitigating factors, including Ted's troubled childhood and the possibility of mental illness. Ted's mother, Louise Bundy, testified emotionally on behalf of her son, pleading with the jury to spare his life. She described Ted as a loving son and insisted that he couldn't possibly be guilty of these terrible crimes. Her testimony was heartbreaking, but it wasn't enough to overcome the evidence of Ted's guilt and the brutality of his crimes. On July 31st, 1979, the jury recommended death. Judge Cowart then delivered the sentence, but not before addressing Ted directly. In a moment that would be replayed countless times over the years, Judge Cowart said, "The court finds that both of these killings were indeed heinous, atrocious, and cruel, and that they were extremely wicked, shockingly evil, vile, and the product of a design to inflict a high degree of pain and utter indifference to human life." Then, in a bizarre turn, Judge Cowart added, "Take care of yourself, young man. I say that to you sincerely. Take care of yourself, please. It is an utter waste of humanity, I think, that you went another way, partner. I don't feel any animosity toward you. I want you to know that. Take care of yourself." This moment captured the strange dynamic that had developed during the trial. Judge Cowart seemed genuinely troubled by the fact that someone as intelligent and potentially successful as Ted had turned to such evil. But the judge's compassion didn't prevent him from formally sentencing Ted to death by electrocution. 6 months later, in January 1980, Ted stood trial again, this time in Orlando for the kidnapping and murder of Kimberly Leach. This trial was less theatrical than the Chi Omega trial, but the evidence was equally compelling. Clarence Anderson, a part-time firefighter, testified that he had seen a man matching Ted's description, leading a young girl into a white van near Kimberly's school on the day she disappeared. Anderson had later been hypnotized to enhance his memory, a controversial technique that would later be ruled inadmissible in Florida courts, but his testimony was allowed in Ted's trial. Fiber evidence also played a crucial role. Fibers found in the van Ted had been driving matched fibers found on Kimberly's clothing. These fibers had a rare manufacturing defect, making the match particularly significant. Additionally, fibers from the clothing Ted was wearing when arrested matched fibers found on Kimberly's body. The testimony about Kimberly's death was particularly difficult for everyone in the courtroom. The medical examiner described the condition of her body when it was found and the injuries she had sustained. Kimberly had been sexually assaulted and murdered. Her body left in a shed where it decomposed for weeks before being discovered. Her family sat through the testimony, their grief and anguish evident to everyone present. Once again, Ted was found guilty. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts, kidnapping and first-degree murder. The penalty phase was brief, and on February 12, 1980, Ted Bundy received his third death sentence. Part 7. Death Row Confessions. After his convictions, Ted Bundy was sent to Florida State Prison in Rancourt, where he would spend the next 9 years on death row. During this time, Ted filed appeal after appeal, challenging his convictions and sentences on various legal grounds. His legal team argued issues ranging from ineffective assistance of counsel to jury selection problems to the admissibility of evidence. Each appeal was carefully crafted, and Ted's cases worked their way through the Florida state courts and the federal court system. For most of these 9 years, Ted continued to maintain his innocence, at least publicly. He gave interviews to journalists and researchers, speaking about himself in the third person and theorizing about what kind of person would commit such crimes. He became something of a celebrity on death row, receiving countless letters from women who claimed to love him and believe in his innocence. In 1980, Ted married Caryn Boone, a woman who had known him during his time in Washington and who had testified as a character witness during his trial. The marriage took place during Ted's trial for the Kimberly Leach murder. During his testimony, Ted asked Caryn to marry him on the stand, and when she said yes in front of a notary public, Florida law recognized this as a legal marriage. Caryn later gave birth to a daughter, conceived during conjugal visits that Ted was somehow able to arrange despite being on death row. But by the late 1980s, Ted's appeals were running out. In mid-1988, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit ruled against him on his remaining claims. In December 1988, the U.S. Supreme Court denied his final petition for review. On January 17, 1989, Florida Governor Bob Martinez signed Ted's death warrant, setting his execution for 7 a.m. on January 24, 1989. With his appeals exhausted and his execution date set, Ted finally decided to talk. He contacted Robert Campbell, the detective who had investigated the Washington murders back in 1974. Campbell had maintained contact with Ted over the years, visiting him occasionally and establishing a rapport. Ted respected Campbell, viewing him as a serious investigator who treated him with a degree of professional courtesy rather than moral judgment. In the days leading up to his execution, Ted also spoke with FBI Special Agent Bill Hagmaier, who had been interviewing him on and off for years. Ted had developed a relationship with Hagmaier, seeing him as someone who was genuinely interested in understanding the psychological aspects of serial murder rather than simply condemning him. Bill Hagmaier was one of the FBI's original behavioral analysis unit agents assigned to what was then a relatively new field of criminal profiling. When Hagmaier first approached Bundy in 1984, the serial killer was skeptical. The FBI had a reputation among criminals, and Bundy initially dismissed Hagmaier as just another investigator trying to extract information from him. But Hagmaier had a different approach. He wasn't there primarily to solve specific cases or get confessions that would lead to prosecutions. Bundy was already on death row for murders he'd been convicted of. Instead, Hagmaier wanted to understand how serial killers thought, how they selected victims, how they avoided detection, and what psychological factors drove them to kill. Over the course of 5 years, from 1984 to 1989, Hagmaier visited Bundy more than 20 times. These visits resulted in over 200 hours of recorded interviews, conversations that would become foundational documents in the field of criminal psychology and profiling. Hagmaier's approach was patient and strategic. He didn't push Bundy to confess. He didn't judge or condemn. Instead, he engaged Bundy in discussions about criminal behavior in general, about psychology, about philosophy, even about mundane topics like family and daily life. This approach worked because it appealed to Bundy's narcissism and his desire to be seen as intelligent and insightful. Bundy liked the idea that he could contribute to the understanding of serial killers. He enjoyed being treated as an expert rather than just a criminal. Hagmaier understood this about Bundy and used it to gradually build trust. The agent made promises he kept, never asking directly if Bundy had killed anyone, never pressing for admissions of guilt in their early conversations. As their relationship developed, something unexpected happened. A genuine connection formed between the FBI agent and the serial killer, though it was a connection built on a foundation of manipulation and necessity. Bundy began to see Hagmaier as perhaps his only real friend, someone who visited him regularly and seemed genuinely interested in his thoughts. For Hagmaier, this relationship was deeply troubling. He was developing rapport with a man whose hands had brutally murdered dozens of women. The cognitive dissonance of this situation weighed heavily on the agent. In their conversations, Bundy revealed details about his psychology that would prove invaluable to criminal profilers. He described how serial killers often go through what he called an amateur phase, where they make mistakes and are impulsive. As they gain experience, they become more organized, more careful, more successful at avoiding detection. This developmental model of serial killer behavior would become an important part of FBI profiling methodology. Bundy also spoke extensively about his methods of victim selection. He described how he would conduct surveillance, watching potential victims to learn their routines and identify vulnerabilities. He talked about the importance of appearing non-threatening, of creating personas that would disarm suspicion. He explained his technique of feigning injury or disability, how this simple prop of an arm sling or crutches could transform him from a potential threat into someone who needed help. In discussions with Hagmaier, Bundy revealed the psychological satisfaction he derived from his crimes. He spoke about murder not just as an act of violence or sexual gratification, but as a form of possession. In one chilling statement that Hagmaier would later recount, Bundy explained, "Murder is not just a crime of lust or violence. It becomes possession. They are part of you, and you are forever one. The grounds where you kill them become sacred to you, and you will always be drawn back to them." This concept of possession helped explain Bundy's pattern of returning to burial sites and engaging in necrophilia with his victims' bodies. For Bundy, the murder wasn't the end of his relationship with his victims. Their bodies became objects he owned, that he could return to and continue to control even after death. This level of psychological insight into the mind of a serial killer was unprecedented, and it would help shape how law enforcement understood and investigated serial murder. Hagmaier also learned about the role of alcohol in Bundy's crimes. Bundy revealed that he often got drunk before attacking victims, using alcohol to lower his inhibitions and disconnect from the moral implications of what he was about to do. This pattern of using substances to facilitate violence was something that would be found in many other serial killers as research continued. As Bundy's execution date approached, the nature of his conversations with Hagmaier changed. With his appeals exhausted and death imminent, Bundy finally became willing to talk specifically about his own crimes, rather than just theorizing about serial killers in general. But even then, he often spoke in the third person, describing the killer rather than explicitly saying, "I did this." This linguistic distancing was one final attempt to maintain some psychological separation from the full horror of his actions. In these final interviews, Ted began to confess, but his confessions came in fits and starts, often delivered in the third person, as though he were describing someone else's actions. Even facing imminent death, Ted couldn't completely let go of his need to maintain some level of control and distance from his crimes. To Campbell, Ted confessed to all 8 of the Washington and Oregon murders for which he had been the prime suspect. He described abducting Lynda Healy from her apartment, detailing how he had entered through a window, knocked her unconscious, dressed her in street clothes, and carried her to his car. He admitted to the Lake Sammamish abductions, explaining how he had lured Janice and Denise Naslund to his car by asking for help with a sailboat that didn't actually exist. Ted described 3 additional murders in Washington that investigators hadn't previously connected to him. He also admitted to 2 murders in Oregon, but declined to identify the victims, suggesting he might not have even known their names. Throughout these confessions, Ted showed almost no emotion. He described these murders in a flat, clinical tone, as though discussing case studies rather than real people he had tortured and killed. Ted also provided details about what he did with some of his victims after death. He admitted to returning to the burial sites and engaging in necrophilia with the bodies until decomposition made it impossible. He described this as a form of possession, saying that keeping the victims' bodies or parts of their bodies allowed him to maintain control over them even after death. To Agent Hagmeyer, Ted opened up about his violent sexual fantasies and how they had developed over time. He spoke about his early consumption of pornography, particularly violent pornography, and how this had fed fantasies that eventually needed to be acted out in reality. He described the planning that went into his crimes, explaining how he would conduct surveillance on potential victims, learning their routines and identifying vulnerabilities. Ted also discussed his psychological state during his crimes. He described experiencing a kind of dissociation during the actual murders, as if he were watching himself from outside his body. This description matched what psychologists understand about serial killers often experiencing a detached, almost dreamlike state during their violent acts, which allows them to compartmentalize the horror of what they're doing. Interestingly, Ted also spoke about his failed attempts to stop killing. He claimed that there were periods when he tried to resist his urges, when he attempted to live a normal life and suppress the violent fantasies. But these periods never lasted long. The compulsion would build until it became overwhelming, and he would eventually give in to it. This pattern of attempted restraint, followed by explosive violence, is common among serial killers. Ted confessed to a total of 30 murders, though he hinted that the actual number might be higher. When asked about specific cases, particularly older unsolved murders, Ted would sometimes become evasive, neither confirming nor denying his involvement. This suggested that there might indeed be additional victims that Ted never formally acknowledged. One of the most disturbing aspects of Ted's confessions was his discussion of victim selection. He admitted that he specifically targeted young women with long dark hair parted in the middle because they resembled Stephanie Brooks, his college girlfriend who had rejected him. This confirmed what many investigators and psychologists had long suspected, that Ted's crimes were motivated in part by rage against women, particularly women who reminded him of someone who had hurt his ego. But Ted also emphasized that his crimes weren't purely about revenge against Stephanie or women in general. he described a more complex set of motivations, including a desire for power and control, sexual gratification, and what he called the hunt, the excitement and satisfaction he derived from stalking, capturing, and dominating another human being. He admitted that the actual killing sometimes felt anticlimactic. It was the process leading up to it that provided the greatest satisfaction. Ted's confessions weren't entirely altruistic. Some investigators believed he was using them as a bargaining chip, trying to trade information for stays of execution. He would hint at knowledge of unsolved cases, suggesting he could help solve them if given more time. This led to a strategy some called bones for time, where Ted would offer to lead investigators to burial sites or provide details about unknown victims in exchange for delays in his execution date. But ultimately, Ted ran out of time and information to trade. His execution date arrived, and despite his last-minute confessions and offers to help solve more cases, Florida officials proceeded with the execution. Ted had killed too many people, caused too much pain, and destroyed too many lives to be granted any more delays. Part 8. Psychological Analysis. Understanding Ted Bundy requires looking at the confluence of multiple psychological factors that created one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. While it's impossible to pinpoint a single cause for his violent behavior, researchers and clinicians who studied Bundy have identified several key elements of his psychological profile. In 2007, a group of 73 psychologists at the University of Kentucky conducted a comprehensive study of Ted Bundy's mental health using available records, interviews, and case materials. The results of this study provide valuable insights into Bundy's personality structure. Almost all of the psychologists agreed that Bundy met the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, with nearly 80% describing him as a prototypical case of the disorder. Antisocial personality disorder is characterized by a pervasive pattern of disregard for the rights of others, lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, and a failure to conform to social norms. Individuals with this disorder often display superficial charm, are highly intelligent, and can appear perfectly normal in casual interactions. They lack genuine emotional connections to other people and view others primarily as objects to be used for their own gratification. Ted Bundy exemplified all of these characteristics, but the diagnosis goes deeper than just antisocial personality disorder. Approximately 95% of the psychologists in the study also believed that Bundy met criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. This disorder is marked by an inflated sense of self-importance, a need for excessive admiration, a sense of entitlement, and a lack of empathy for others. Narcissistic individuals often have a grandiose view of their own abilities and accomplishments, combined with an underlying fragility of self-esteem that makes them hypersensitive to criticism or perceived slights. In Ted's case, this narcissism manifested in multiple ways. He believed he was smarter than everyone around him, including law enforcement and even the attorneys trying to help him. He insisted on representing himself in court, convinced that he could outmaneuver the prosecutors despite having no actual trial experience. His narcissism also made him hypersensitive to rejection, as evidenced by his reaction to Stephanie Brooks's breakup and his apparent need to punish her by later dumping her when she became vulnerable to him again. Dr. Thomas Whittaker, a psychology professor at the University of Kentucky who has studied Bundy extensively, characterized his personality using the 5-factor model of personality. According to Whittaker's analysis, Bundy scored extremely high on antagonism, which encompasses traits like being deceptive, manipulative, callous, exploitative, and arrogant. He also showed high levels of disinhibition, marked by irresponsible and impulsive behavior, despite his ability to plan carefully when it served his purposes. Whittaker concluded that Bundy could be described as a successful psychopath, someone who possessed the core traits of psychopathy: antagonism, lack of empathy, manipulativeness, but who also had enough conscientiousness and intelligence to function effectively in society for extended periods. This allowed Bundy to maintain his facade of normalcy while secretly engaging in horrific crimes. The concept of psychopathy is crucial to understanding Ted Bundy. Psychologist Hervey Cleckley, who essentially defined the modern concept of psychopathy, created a checklist of traits that characterize the disorder. These include superficial charm, above-average intelligence, absence of anxiety or nervousness, insincerity, lack of remorse or shame, poor judgment, inability to learn from experience, pathological egocentricity, and lack of genuine emotional connections. Ted Bundy exhibited every single one of these traits. One of the most chilling aspects of Bundy's psychology was his own self-awareness. He once described himself as the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'll ever meet, a statement that his defense attorney, Polly Nelson, said was accurate. Ann Rule, his friend-turned-biographer, described him as a sadistic sociopath who took pleasure from another human's pain and the control he had over his victims to the point of death and even after. Some experts have also suggested that Bundy may have had elements of borderline personality disorder, characterized by unstable relationships, mood swings, and intense but shallow emotions. However, this diagnosis was less universally agreed upon among the psychologists who studied his case. The extreme mood swings and emotional volatility that characterize borderline personality disorder didn't align perfectly with Bundy's generally controlled demeanor, though he did show instability in his personal relationships. Dr. Dorothy Lewis, a psychiatrist who specialized in evaluating violent offenders, argued that Bundy suffered from bipolar disorder. She pointed to periods of depression and potential manic episodes as evidence. However, this diagnosis was controversial and not widely accepted by other experts who studied Bundy. Lewis's attempt to use this diagnosis to argue against Bundy's execution was unsuccessful. The question of nature versus nurture in Bundy's case remains unresolved. His childhood was undeniably troubled. The deception about his parentage, exposure to violence, and mental illness in his grandfather's home, the confusion and shame surrounding his origins. But plenty of people experience difficult childhoods without becoming serial killers. Conversely, research suggests that psychopathy has significant genetic and neurobiological components. It's likely that Bundy's development involved both genetic predisposition and environmental factors. Bundy's own explanations for his behavior changed over time and depending on his audience. In his final interview, given to religious counselor James Dobson just before his execution, Bundy blamed pornography for his crimes. He claimed that violent pornography had fueled his fantasies and eventually drove him to act them out. However, most experts view this explanation with skepticism. Bundy may have been trying to provide a simple, socially acceptable explanation for his behavior, or he may have been manipulating his interviewer to get sympathy. While pornography consumption may have been a factor in the development of his violent fantasies, it certainly wasn't the sole cause of his crimes. The role of rejection and humiliation in Bundy's psychology also bears examination. His breakup with Stephanie Brooks seems to have been a significant psychological trigger. The fact that his known victims resembled Stephanie suggests that his crimes were motivated in part by rage toward women who reminded him of her. But again, this can't be the complete explanation. Many people experience painful breakups without becoming murderers. Bundy's reaction to rejection was filtered through his psychopathic personality structure, his narcissism, and his pre-existing violent fantasies. One particularly interesting aspect of Bundy's psychology was his ability to compartmentalize. He could be charming and helpful at the crisis hotline, then go out and stalk potential victims the same evening. He could maintain a relationship with Elizabeth Clover while simultaneously planning and committing murders. This ability to separate different aspects of his life to maintain multiple contradictory personas is characteristic of psychopathy, but was particularly pronounced in Bundy's case. Neuroscience research on psychopathy has shown that individuals with this disorder have differences in brain structure and function, particularly in areas involved in emotion processing and impulse control. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex and amygdala, brain regions crucial for empathy and emotional response, show reduced activity in psychopathic individuals. While Bundy's brain was examined after his execution, no gross abnormalities were found. However, the technology available at the time wasn't sophisticated enough to detect the kinds of subtle differences in brain structure and chemistry that modern neuroimaging might reveal. What makes Bundy's case particularly significant from a psychological perspective is how completely he violated expectations. He didn't fit the stereotype of a serial killer. He was educated, charming, and attractive. He had relationships, held jobs, and functioned in society. This has led to important advances in understanding that serial killers can come from any background and don't necessarily exhibit obvious signs of their pathology. Bundy's psychology also illustrates the concept of the mask of sanity that Cleckley identified. Psychopaths can appear completely normal, even exemplary, on the surface, while hiding profound emotional and moral deficits underneath. They learn to mimic normal emotions and social behaviors, creating a convincing facade that allows them to move through society without detection. Ted Bundy was a master of this performance, maintaining his mask even under the most intense scrutiny, only letting it slip in rare, unguarded moments. Part 9. The Execution. By January 1989, Ted Bundy had exhausted all of his legal appeals. The U.S. Supreme Court had denied his final petition for review, and Florida Governor Bob Martinez had signed the death warrant. Ted's execution was scheduled for 7 a.m. on January 24, 1989. In his final days, the reality of his impending death seemed to finally penetrate the denial and narcissism that had characterized his behavior for years. Ted spent his last week giving interviews and making confessions, still trying to control the narrative even as his life was coming to an end. He spoke with investigators from multiple states, finally admitting to murders he had denied for over a decade. But even in these confessions, Ted maintained a certain level of control, speaking often in the third person and withholding details that might have brought closure to additional families. The night before his execution, Ted called his mother twice. Louise Bundy had stood by her son throughout the years, insisting on his innocence even as the evidence against him mounted. In their final conversations, what they discussed remains private, but Louise would later say that she told Ted she loved him and that she would always believe in him. The pain in her voice when she spoke to reporters after Ted's death was evident. She had lost her son twice, once to his crimes and once to the electric chair. Ted declined a special last meal, a tradition often offered to condemned prisoners. Instead, he was given the standard prison fare: steak, eggs, hash browns, and toast. He reportedly didn't eat it, perhaps too nervous, or perhaps finally confronting the reality of what was about to happen. He spent the evening with Reverend Fred Lawrence, a Methodist minister who had been counseling him. They prayed together, though what Ted actually believed at that point is impossible to know. Throughout his life, Ted had used religion instrumentally, claiming faith when it served his purposes, but showing little evidence of genuine spirituality. Outside Florida State Prison in Rayford, a crowd had begun gathering the night before the execution. By the early morning hours, approximately 2,000 people had assembled across from the prison gates. They wore T-shirts with slogans like "Burn Bundy" and "Toast Ted." They carried signs celebrating the execution. Some brought coolers of beer, turning the event into a tailgate party. A woman sold coffee and donuts to the crowd. Someone distributed electric chair lapel pins. When news came that the execution had been carried out, the crowd erupted in cheers. They chanted "Burn, Bundy, burn," and set off fireworks. It was a scene that made some observers uncomfortable, a public celebration of death that seemed to reduce a solemn legal proceeding to a festival of vengeance. But others argued that given the magnitude of Bundy's crimes and the suffering he had caused, the public's reaction was understandable. Inside the prison, the atmosphere was very different. 42 official witnesses had been selected to attend the execution, including law enforcement officials, prosecutors, reporters, and representatives from victims' families. The witnesses were led into the execution chamber, a small room containing Old Sparky, Florida's electric chair. The chair was made of oak, bolted to the floor with leather straps to secure the condemned person's arms, legs, and torso. At 7 a.m., guards escorted Ted Bundy into the execution chamber. He was wearing blue slacks and a light blue shirt. Witnesses reported that when Ted first saw the electric chair, he appeared startled, momentarily losing the composure he had maintained. His face registered recognition and perhaps fear. Ted was led to the chair and secured with leather straps across his chest, arms, and legs. A metal cap containing a sponge soaked in saline solution was placed on his head to ensure good electrical contact. Electrodes were attached to his leg. The superintendent of the prison, Tom Barton, asked Ted if he had any last words. Ted's voice quavered slightly as he said, "Jim, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." He was speaking to Jim Coleman, one of his attorneys, and to Reverend Lawrence. Then a thick strap was pulled across his mouth and chin. A heavy black veil attached to the skull cap was lowered over his face, hiding his features from the witnesses. Superintendent Barton gave the signal. At 7:06 a.m., an anonymous executioner activated the electric chair. 2,000 volts of electricity surged through Ted Bundy's body. His body tensed, his hands clenched, and a small wisp of smoke rose from his right leg where the electrode was attached. The current was applied for 1 minute, then turned off. A paramedic opened Ted's shirt and checked for a heartbeat. Another examined his eyes with a light. At 7:16 a.m., Ted Bundy was pronounced dead. One of the witnesses, Tallahassee police officer Gulfport Sewell, later commented, "Regardless of what Bundy did, he was still a human being." But even Sewell admitted feeling relief that Bundy was dead, a sentiment that seemed universal among those who knew about his crimes. After the execution, Ted's body underwent an autopsy. Medical examiners paid particular attention to his brain, searching for abnormalities that might explain his behavior. No significant injuries or abnormalities were found, contradicting theories that Bundy's crimes might have been caused by brain damage or physical defects. The autopsy essentially confirmed what psychologists had long known. Bundy's pathology was psychological, not neurological. Bundy's body was cremated, and according to his wishes, his ashes were scattered in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state, the very area where he had committed some of his earliest murders. This final request struck some as grotesquely inappropriate, as serial killer's remains mingling with the landscapes where his victims had suffered and died. News of Ted Bundy's execution made headlines around the world. For many, it represented the end of a horrific chapter in American crime history. The families of Bundy's victims expressed relief and a sense that justice had finally been served, though for many of them, the pain of their loss remained as acute as ever. Eleanor Cowell's daughter, whose remains were found near Issaquah, said simply, "Good. The only thing I can say is thank God it's finally over." In the weeks and months following the execution, there was extensive public discussion about the case. Some argued that Bundy should have been kept alive so that researchers could study him and potentially learn more about the psychology of serial killers. Others countered that Bundy had proven himself manipulative and uncooperative throughout his incarceration, and there was no reason to believe he would have provided meaningful assistance to researchers. The debate over capital punishment was also reignited by Bundy's execution. Opponents of the death penalty argued that even someone as clearly guilty and evil as Bundy should not have been executed, that society should not lower itself to the level of a killer. Supporters of capital punishment argued that Bundy was precisely the kind of criminal for whom the death penalty was designed, someone who had committed multiple heinous murders and who posed an ongoing danger to society. Florida Governor Bob Martinez, who had signed Bundy's death warrant, defended the decision, saying, "The people of Florida today administered justice. If there's ever been anyone on Florida's death row that deserved the electric chair, Ted Bundy was that individual." This sentiment was widely shared among the public and law enforcement officials who had pursued Bundy for years. Part 10. Legacy and Conclusion. Ted Bundy's impact on American society and the field of criminal justice extends far beyond his individual crimes. His case fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches serial murder investigations, how the public understands such criminals, and how the media covers these cases. Before Bundy, serial killers were often thought of in stereotypical terms: loners, social outcasts, people who were obviously disturbed or different. Bundy shattered these preconceptions. He proved that serial killers could be charming, educated, and superficially normal. This realization led to significant changes in how police profile potential suspects and in how the public thinks about personal safety. The investigation into Bundy's crimes highlighted serious problems with information sharing between law enforcement jurisdictions. Cases in Washington, Utah, Colorado, and Florida were all being investigated by different agencies with minimal communication between them. This allowed Bundy to operate across state lines for years before investigators realized they were all pursuing the same perpetrator. In response to these failures, Robert Campbell, one of the primary detectives on the Bundy case, developed the Homicide Investigation Tracking System, or HITS. This database system allows law enforcement agencies to input and analyze information about violent crimes, making it easier to identify patterns and connect cases across jurisdictions. HITS represented a significant advancement in serial crime investigation and became a model for similar systems across the country. Bundy's trials, particularly the Chi Omega case, were also groundbreaking in their use of forensic evidence. The bite mark testimony was controversial but ultimately accepted by the jury, helping to establish forensic odontology as a legitimate forensic science. The case also involved fiber analysis and other forensic techniques that were relatively new at the time. These technical advancements influenced how evidence is collected and analyzed in criminal cases. The media coverage of the Bundy case was unprecedented. His trial was the first to be broadcast nationally on television, setting a precedent for the media circuses that would surround high-profile criminal cases in subsequent decades. The public's fascination with Bundy, driven by his good looks and intelligence, also established a template for how certain criminals become celebrities. This phenomenon continues today with documentaries, movies, and books about serial killers generating significant public interest and commercial success. For victims' families, Bundy's legacy is one of enduring pain. Many of his victims' bodies were never recovered, leaving families without closure. Others had to endure years of trials, appeals, and media coverage that repeatedly forced them to relive their losses. Some family members have spoken out about the troubling glorification of Bundy in popular culture, arguing that the focus on the killer rather than his victims is disrespectful and potentially harmful. The case has also had a lasting impact on how women think about personal safety. Bundy's ability to disarm victims by appearing harmless or asking for help has made many people more cautious about helping strangers. The techniques he used, feigning injury, impersonating authority figures, have been widely publicized as warning signs. Self-defense instructors often use Bundy's case as an example of how predators operate. From a psychological perspective, Bundy's case continues to be studied extensively. He represents a particularly extreme example of psychopathy combined with intelligence and superficial social skills. Researchers continue to analyze interview transcripts, court records, and other materials related to Bundy in attempts to better understand the psychology of serial killers. His case has contributed to refinements in the diagnostic criteria for personality disorders and has influenced how forensic psychologists evaluate dangerous individuals. And the question of whether Ted Bundy could have been stopped earlier remains a source of frustration and debate. There were multiple opportunities when warning signs were visible: his early childhood behaviors, his voyeurism and theft as a teenager, his awkward social development. But none of these, taken individually, were sufficient to identify him as someone who would become a serial killer. This reflects the difficulty in predicting violent behavior many people exhibit concerning behaviors without becoming violent criminals. Some have argued that if Elizabeth Clover had reported her suspicions earlier, or if Anne Rule had come forward with her concerns, lives might have been saved. But this criticism seems unfair. Both women did eventually contact police, and when they did, their tips were added to lists containing thousands of other names. The system for processing and prioritizing these tips was inadequate, and even credible information often got lost in the volume of data. Others have suggested that the criminal justice system failed by allowing Bundy to escape twice. The security lapses that permitted these escapes were certainly problematic, and they did result in additional deaths, but they also reflected a more general underestimation of Bundy's danger and manipulativeness. He presented himself as a rational, educated person who might be guilty of some crimes, but was fundamentally reasonable. This image allowed him to be housed in facilities with inadequate security for someone of his true nature. The exact number of Bundy's victims will never be known. He confessed to 30 murders, but investigators believe the actual number could be much higher. Some estimates suggest he may have killed more than 100 people, though this number is speculative. Criminologist Matt DeLisi has argued, based on the pacing and confidence of Bundy's known crimes, that he almost certainly killed for years before his first confirmed murder in 1974, possibly starting as early as his teenage years. Unsolved disappearances and murders in areas where Bundy lived or traveled continue to be examined for possible connections to him. The case of 8-year-old Anne-Marie Burr, who disappeared in 1961 from Tacoma when Bundy was 14, remains open. While Bundy denied involvement even before his execution, the proximity and timing keep suspicions alive. Other cases, particularly missing women from the Pacific Northwest in the late 1960s and early 1970s, also raise questions about whether Bundy was responsible. What lessons can be drawn from Ted Bundy's life and crimes? Perhaps the most important is the danger of judging people solely by their surface appearances. Bundy looked and acted like someone trustworthy, and this allowed him to evade suspicion for years. His case reminds us that evil can wear a charming mask, that intelligence and education don't preclude violence, and that we must be cautious about who we trust. The case also illustrates the importance of effective communication and coordination in law enforcement. Bundy was able to operate across multiple jurisdictions precisely because agencies weren't sharing information effectively. Modern databases and communication systems have improved this situation, but vigilance is still required to ensure that patterns aren't missed. From a psychological perspective, Bundy's case reinforces the understanding that psychopathy is a serious and dangerous personality disorder. Individuals with severe antisocial and narcissistic traits, especially when combined with violent fantasies and lack of empathy, pose significant risks. Early identification and intervention with troubled individuals, while ethically and practically complex, may be important for preventing future tragedies. It's also important to remember the victims. Behind the headlines and the psychological analyses were real people with families who loved them. Lynda Ann Healy, Donna Gail Manson, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, Brenda Ball, Georgann Hawkins, Janice Ott, Denise Naslund, Melissa Smith, Laura Aime, Carol DeRonch, who survived, Deborah Kent, Caryn Campbell, Julie Cunningham, Denise Oliverson, Nancy Baird, Melanie Cooley, Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, Kimberly Leach, and so many others, named and unnamed. Each had dreams and potential that were stolen from them. Each left behind family members who have had to live with loss and trauma. In the years since Ted Bundy's execution, his name has become part of popular culture. Movies, documentaries, books, and television shows have examined his life and crimes. Some of this attention has been criticized as glorifying or sensationalizing a killer. There's a valid concern that too much focus on Bundy himself, rather than his victims, is inappropriate and potentially harmful, yet there's also value in studying cases like Bundy's, not to glorify the killer, but to understand how such individuals operate, how they can be identified and stopped, and how society can better protect potential victims. The key is maintaining a balance, learning from these cases while never forgetting the human cost, the lives lost, and the families forever changed by one man's evil choices. Ted Bundy's execution on January 24, 1989, ended his life, but his impact continues. The systems he exposed as inadequate have been improved. The investigative techniques his case advanced continue to evolve. The psychological understanding he contributed to, however unwillingly, has helped researchers better understand personality disorders and violent behavior. But perhaps the most lasting legacy should be a simple awareness. Evil can look like anyone. It can be charming, intelligent, and superficially normal. It can sit next to you in class, work alongside you at a crisis hotline, or date your friend. The only defense is vigilance, healthy skepticism, and systems of justice that work cooperatively to identify and stop predators before they can claim more victims. As we conclude this examination of Ted Bundy's life and crimes, take a moment to reflect on the fragility of human life and the importance of protecting one another. If this story has taught us anything, it's that we must be careful, we must be aware, and we must never assume that evil announces itself with an obvious face. Sometimes it wears a smile. Closing. Thank you for joining me tonight for this deep examination into one of the darkest chapters of American criminal history. I hope this has been informative and thought-provoking, even as it has necessarily been disturbing. These are difficult stories to tell, but they are important stories to understand. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more true crime content, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. I cover a wide range of cases, from historical mysteries to modern investigations, always with respect for the victims and a focus on understanding rather than sensationalism. Sleep well, everyone, and remember, stay safe out there.